Each week, we get to the heart of the issue dominating the headlines. The National Grid, responsible for keeping the lights on, has warned of the possibility of rolling 3-hour blackouts, leaving us all to hope that our demand for energy doesn't outstrip supply. Liz Truss insists that Britain will have enough to make it through the colder months. But ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, we've become acutely aware of just how vulnerable we are. As ever, our viewers panel from across the country and indeed across the world will tell us their stories. They'll have their say. Joining us in the studio this week are Catherine Porter, energy consultant at Watt Logic; Charles Hendry, the former Conservative MP and former energy minister; Liam Norton from the pressure group Insulate Britain; and Tom Greatrex, Chief Executive of the Nuclear Industry Association. So let's take a look at the big question tonight. Energy crisis. Can we keep the lights on this winter?
We are asking you to cut down to the absolute minimum the use of electricity for heating and for other purposes in your home.
Every time I'm with it alone, picks me up, you just send it down.
The possibility of energy rationing. Can you rule that out, Liz Truss?
I do rule that out, yes.
You rule out energy rationing, OK.
Breaking news this hour, and households are to be paid to avoid using electricity during peak hours this winter.
This warning, in a very worst-case scenario of planned blackouts, will be alarming to many.
It is extremely unlikely, but it's only right that we plan for every scenario.
This is a damning indictment of Conservative policy over the last 12 years.
500,000 roof tiles, 250,000 bricks could be lost.
Much of Europe is taking part in energy demand strategies, reducing their demand.
Tell someone, to switch things off for the national need when it makes no difference to the national security position.
Well, let's start, as always, with our viewers panel. And I'm going to talk, first of all, to Angela and Stephen Gilligan, who are in Scotland. Angela, Stephen, are you getting ready for winter?
Absolutely, Trevor. I'm old enough to remember the power cuts in the 70s, Trevor. It was miserable. I describe it as lockdown in the cold. Let's not dress it up as anything else.
So what do you anticipate, having been through all of that? And, I don't want to admit to having been there too, but it was a pretty heavy time.
Yes, absolutely. I think what we were talking about is preparation. We have to, we've been told that it's not going to happen, but we've heard that so many times. So we have to look at practical advice and have things on hand. Our experience from the 1970s, we found out that just preparing will be the way forward, I think.
In your preparation, Angela, Stephen, what are you doing? Are you getting warm clothes? I mean, what about, are you getting out the thermals?
Well, living in the west of Scotland, we already have thermals. I have been in a thermal vest and other clothes, obviously, for the last few weeks. Our temperatures are much colder than you have in the south and wetter, and living in the west of Scotland in particular. So we generally are geared up for cooler temperatures. But obviously that's the difference when you have blackouts and you're in darkness and you need to think, right, what are we going to do to prepare? So having things at hand in a convenient place, because you forget, especially in the west of Scotland or Scotland as a whole, it's very dark here. Our nights now, we're dark outside, and if you have blackouts, you have no light whatsoever. So if that was to happen, you've got to prepare torches, candles, think ahead.
Well, Angela and Stephen, first of all, can I just say thank you? That was the most brilliant public service advertisement I've seen in a long time. Thank you for your experience. Let's go next to Derek Watson. Derek, you're in Sunderland. What's your thought about the situation we're facing?
Well, Trevor, I do believe Liz Truss is fueling misinformation by blaming the war in Ukraine for our energy crisis, when there is a bigger picture to this all. Russia only contributes 4% of UK gas supplies. We're deflecting from the real issue. So my question to the panel would be, is it fair to blame the energy crisis on the war in Ukraine?
Thank you, Derek. Very direct question there. Let's go to our panel. Derek is asking, is it fair to blame the energy crisis on the war in Ukraine? Charles Hendry.
It's absolutely the case that that's the big factor this winter, which has changed things beyond recognition from where we've been in previous years. The government rightly made a decision that we should stand with Ukraine. The British public have decided that the government is right to do that, and therefore the government has to insulate and protect the public from the worst effects of those policies. Of course, we only do get about 4% of our gas from Russia. In fact, that's now been stopped. But the biggest issue, of course, is that Germany gets half of its gas, Italy gets 60–70% of its gas, so that this is having a knock-on effect across Europe. And our gas networks are all connected. We are not an island in energy terms. We have gas coming in from Norway, from Qatar, and we've got pipes going into Europe as well, into mainland Europe.
And that was a choice that we made, wasn't it?
Completely.
That actually we didn't, for example, we'll come to the issue of storage later, we didn't store gas. We wanted to rely on the broader global supply.
Well, that was part of it. Historically, we didn't need so much storage because the North Sea was our gas storage facility. And if we needed more, we could get more out in a response to the market situations. So that we do need more storage, absolutely. And mistakes have been made by governments over many years not to go down that route.
Catherine, would we be in this situation without the Ukraine war?
Yes, we would. In my opinion, we're actually experiencing two different energy crises at the moment. The crisis in the gas market, which is a result of what's happening in Ukraine, but we're having a crisis in the electricity market, and that's a result of poor policy. And this is over decades. It's not just the current government, it's previous governments, and other countries have a similar issue. Following a wind-led energy transition without taking care of what happens when it isn't windy is the reason we're going to struggle to meet demand in the electricity market this winter.
Tom, do you agree with this analysis of why we're in the situation that we're in?
I do. I mean, I think the points that Charles was making actually explain the problem. The problem is that over the long term, we haven't properly planned to replace electricity generating capacity that's been going offline and is going offline now, our nuclear fleet, coal power stations, gas-fired power stations, and we haven't adequately planned for that move from fossil fuel being the dominant part of our electricity mix to having a much more low-carbon mix. It makes it much more difficult for the national grid, and it's made even more difficult because a combination of factors, it's not just about Ukraine, it's also about looking at what's happening with, for example, the ability to be able to import from hydropower from Scandinavia when water levels are low, for example. There's a whole range of different factors that are making this a very, very tight winter. But it wasn't unpredictable. In fact, it was predicted. We've ended up in a situation which we really shouldn't have been in if there'd been proper planning about how we run our energy system.
And Liam, do you agree with this point? We'll come to the issue of whether we can reduce our use, but do you agree with, I think, the consensus here that there's been a shortage of planning against foreseeable risks?
Yeah, I think I was on interviews last year predicting an energy crisis, as I think many commentators were. It's obvious that the war has had an effect on energy prices, that's obvious. But I think we've seen decades of incompetence and I'd kind of argue corruption almost from some successive governments where they haven't been interested in benefiting ordinary people, but in benefiting rich, big business and corporations, and we're seeing the consequences of that now.
Let's go back to our viewers' panel and talk a bit more about what this might mean for people and talk to Jackie Mahoney. Jackie, I know that both in your personal and also in your professional life, you're pretty concerned.
Yes, Trevor, I am. I'm a social worker and I work with carer support workers and I work with vulnerable people in the community. Myself and the carer support workers who I work with provide essential support to those most vulnerable in society. My question is how can we be expected to help those in need on their essential visits when so many people in my industry, particularly carer support workers, are on low pay and struggling themselves.
Jackie, just to be clear, for you, is it just a matter of money? Would that be the thing that helps?
I think, Trevor, for me, the social care system as a whole is in a crisis and in a critical state. I think it's always where you spend money. So I think money needs to be more targeted to those groups of people who are going to be affected most. If you are going to recruit and retain people in social care as a vital part of society, then you do need to attract those people into the industry. It's essential. People are also reliant on key pieces of equipment. They're reliant on, for their own health, that's oxygen machines, defibrillators, all sorts of equipment that needs electricity and warmth. You know, it cuts across all age ranges.
OK. Charles Hendry, I think what Jackie is telling us is that we're hearing stories about blackouts and problems of supply, but it's not just a problem of some people feeling cold while they're watching the telly. This is now an issue that could be a bigger problem for the country in all sorts of ways.
I think there's two different issues, and I think you could see the audience reaction to what Jackie was saying and the huge amount of sympathy for the circumstances which she's in. One is the physical ability to keep the system operating, and if there's international shortages, what does that mean? And the second is whether people can afford to heat their homes. Now, the government has already moved to address some of those issues, but this is a very scary winter for a very large number of people. And the government needs to be willing to do more if that is shown to be the case. It could have insulated homes. It could have had a national programme going back months, and we could be going into this winter in a much better prepared state for those who are most vulnerable. But it made decisions not to do that. And so it needs to be willing to step up. This is, as I said earlier, we are in a war situation, and it's beholden on the government to make sure that it does everything it can to protect those who are most vulnerable.
All right. Let me come back to Derek Watson, who asked the question about whether we can lay this at the feet, as it were, of the war in Ukraine. Derek, what's your view, having heard others on the viewers' panel and those in the studio?
I think the war in Ukraine does contribute, but I think the core issue is the misinformation coming from the government. And when you have misinformation, you have a lack of trust. And when you have lack of trust, there's instability in the market and within the households across the UK. And if you look to Europe, Europe has a stronger, clearer message going out to their communities across their countries, particularly in France, Germany, Spain, Finland, whereby it's almost creating a national culture whereby it's a together process in which people want to work with the governments, save energy, cut down on their uses, not just the households, but also commercial businesses, dimming lights, reducing their energy costs.
I'm only stopping you now, Derek, because you're anticipating what we're going to talk about next. This is the great debate. Up next, essential advice or a waste of money. Do we need a government campaign to tell us how to cut back?
We have still not heard anything from government around demand reduction.
They're going to tell us what we're
not doing is spending £14 million on a government campaign.
I don't think it's a nanny state to offer practical advice that people can choose to follow or not. I think it's just helpful.
Welcome back to the great debate, where we're discussing the energy crisis. Can we keep the lights on this winter? Well, unlike much of Europe, our government has ruled out a public information campaign with tips to show people how they can cut down their energy use. As one minister told me on Sky News yesterday, there's lots of information on the internet and such campaigns cost money. But will the government's horror at being seen as the nanny state just leave us all more vulnerable this winter? Let's go to our viewers' panel, and I'm going to talk to Victoria Scholes. Victoria, do you think you know what you need to know, or would you welcome a public information campaign?
No, there needs to be a lot more information.
I'm in a wheelchair, and I'm use a lot of extra electricity due to my disability, charging my power chair, using my stair lift. There's a lack of information on these things. I'm on the priority register with my energy supplier. So if the lights are turned out, I'm hoping I will be okay, as I've been advised. But a lot of people don't know that that help is out there for them. So more needs to be done to show that that help is available to them.
Shouldn't that be the job of the suppliers, Victoria?
The suppliers do have to take some information and feed it out, but also the government, if they did a national campaign to get it out there, then it's a whole nationwide. They need to take responsibility, as they've put us partly in this situation to begin with.
All right, now you've got a question for our panel coming out of all of that.
Yeah, so it's, do people need to take the energy crisis more seriously?
Thank you very much, Victoria. And I think in people you also include our authorities. The question is, should we be taking this crisis more seriously? Tom Greatrex.
I think we should. I mean, I think we've talked a bit about the potential impact in terms of supply, but in terms of use, I'm not quite old enough to remember the 1970s, Trevor, like you, but I am able to go onto YouTube and look back at some of the campaigns that were done in the 70s, and there was the Delia Smith involved in one that was about energy sense is common sense. And it is, to some extent, about those types of things. I just don't get this sense from the government that they're really reluctant to provide and help to amplify good information of things you can do that will have an impact in terms of reducing your costs of energy over the course of this winter. So, for example, if you've got a condensing boiler, making sure the flow temperature is at the right level is a way of not affecting the amount of heat you're going to be able to use, but actually significantly reducing your energy use. That's just one example, and there are a whole load of them. Now, some of us in this room will know about some of them. Some of those in your audience will know about some of them, but a lot of people won't know about any of them at all. And I don't understand this mentality from Nadeem Sahawi saying yesterday that spending £40 million at the same time as just the biggest intervention ever in terms of public financing for underwriting energy bills for consumers and businesses over the next few months, it just doesn't stack up. I think it's common sense to be able to help people understand how they can be part of making sure they're using energy wisely.
All right, well, actually, let's try something. Let's see. Let's put what you just said to the test. And I'm going to come back to the viewers' panel. I hope you're all paying attention, because I'm going to do a little quiz here. I want to know who amongst you knows how to lower the temperature of your boiler. How many of you could go off after this programme and lower the temperature for your boiler by, let's say, 2 degrees? Hands up. Who knows how to do it? I am looking, and thus far, you're all pretty smart. That's why we let you on the programme. And I have to say, I don't know the answer to that question, by the way, and probably about half of you do. Catherine, what do you think? Public information campaign or waste of time?
Well, I think I'm a bit torn on this, actually. The situation in Europe is actually quite different because they have an outright need to reduce their energy consumption. They have a real danger, although unless they have cold weather this winter, they probably can get through with the gas they have available. The problem is next summer, will they get the gas they need to store up ahead of next winter? And so reducing overall demand is really important. Our issue in Britain isn't the same. We're not likely to run out of gas. Our issue is in electricity, where we could run out of electricity when it's not windy. And so our electricity system can be overloaded for certain periods of time. And the behaviours that you need to manage that risk are quite different from the behaviours that you need for generally reducing energy consumption. That's all about moving your consumption from one period to another. And I think if we get into that territory that we need that sort of response from the public, then we'd need a campaign for that at the time it's needed. Having it now wouldn't really help, and you'd run the risk that people would get maybe a bit bored with the whole thing, that they would get a bit fatigued with taking these actions, and then when it's really needed, they won't act. So in January, February, we might really need people to reduce demand at particular times of the day and really target them with that information.
So anyway, rather than as we did with COVID, choose the moment for maximum impact. Just quickly, Liam, do you agree with that?
I think we need a public information campaign to communicate the risks of using fossil fuels. And that's what Insulate Britain were proposing last year. We had a plan, a no-brainer plan, which would have given best value for money in terms of per pound spent and reducing the country's emissions. It would have, if you look at the Office of National Statistics last year, before this energy crisis was in the news, they said that 8,500 elderly people froze to death in their homes each year because they couldn't afford to heat their homes. It would have eradicated millions of people and brought them out of fuel poverty so they didn't have to choose between heating, eating or essentials. It would have provided hundreds of thousands of proper, meaningful jobs. It would have boosted the economy of this country, and it's been ignored. But ultimately, what we need to do is convince the general public that we need to get off fossil fuels quickly, because we are within this in a catastrophic climate risk at the moment.
We're going to come back to this issue of reducing demand a bit later, but in fact, I did myself take the Minister's advice and go to the government's website to see if I could get some tips about how I could save energy. Number one, the website kind of crashed, but number two, what it essentially said is change your boiler. And I'm going to bring in somebody now who has done that, Phil Hinchcliffe, who lives in East London. Phil, what was your experience of trying to reduce your energy usage?
I installed a heat pump in a Victorian terraced house, and I paid within the region of £35,000 to £40,000 to install a system that will work as efficiently as possible. Now, for a heat pump to work properly, you need a large surface area which runs at a cooler temperature than your normal average gas boiler radiator. The result was I had to put in underfloor heating everywhere in my house. And as you can imagine, it's not cheap. The heat pump itself cost about £24,000 with all the bits. And by the time I'd installed everything, it took me a year to finally work out why the house was still cold. And basically, if you run a heat pump in a really well-insulated house, yes, it makes some sort of sense. Even in a well-insulated Victorian terrace like mine, it's borderline. And if you don't put in underfloor heating and you just use radiators, then heat pumps guzzle so much electricity, simply people aren't going to be able to pay the electricity bill.
Wow. I mean, that is... Stay there, Phil. Liam, that is expenditure, I think, by my reckoning, about 1.5 times the average British household's annual income. Worth it or not?
I think is surviving...
And he's done what you want him to do, insulate and all of that.
Is saving our society from collapse worth it? I'd ask you that question. Do you think it's worth it? Is that
what a heat pump for heat pumps for all? That's the price. That's what we're going to be doing.
We need to come off fossil fuels. This is the reality that exists, whether we like it or not. That is the situation that we exist within. There's obvious challenges, as the gentleman describes, and they exist all over the country. It's an incredibly large project that we need to undertake across the country. But they're still building, the government is still building new properties with gas boilers in 2022. It's criminal.
After tax, that's the best part of 2 years' income for most people, Liam. Charles, is that possible?
But just quickly as well, like the government have just borrowed £150 billion and going to give it directly to energy companies, and that's going to in-debt ordinary people so that energy companies can make more profit. So where do we want this public money to go to?
Well, there are different low-carbon solutions for different houses. And so we've just moved house. It's a barn conversion. We've looked to see whether we could have a heat pump, and they've come and said, no, this house is too leaky. You've got to put in too many new radiators. It will be prohibitively expensive. Exactly the same issue there as we've just had. But what we have got is we've got solar, we've got electric radiators. We will find other ways of using renewable power to make our house much more efficient. And so it's not one answer fits all. We've got to have a range of different solutions, which are increasingly out there. And if you'll allow me, I'd want to come back on the other earlier question, which I didn't get a chance to comment on, which is about the government information campaign. Derek said earlier that people don't trust government, and I think he's probably right. I think it's important that we have a campaign which is funded by government, but is delivered through citizen advice or Martin Lewis or the local authorities, but through an organisation who are trusted and people will listen to in a way that they will believe what they're being told. And I also want to see councils knocking on the doors, supported by government funding, of the people who are most vulnerable to see what help they can be given now to help them get ready for the winter and be able to come through it better.
This is the great debate. And in our next part, we're going to ask why Britain doesn't store more of its own energy like other European countries to see us through the winter months.
They've degraded our gas storage facilities. They've criticised solar panels in fields.
Most countries in Europe have got more gas storage facilities than we have.
We do have a good supply of energy in the UK. We're in a much better position than many other countries.
Welcome back to the great debate where we're discussing the energy crisis. We're asking, can we keep the lights on this winter? Britain is in some ways in a far more fortunate position than the rest of Europe because we don't rely as much on Russian gas for our energy supply as we heard earlier on. But we do rely on our neighbours importing large amounts of gas from Norway and electricity from France. I'm going to talk to Andreas Eriksson, Norway's Deputy Energy Minister. Good evening, Mr. Eriksson. Thank you for joining us.
Evening, sir. Thank you for having me on the programme.
We read that Norway is facing its own shortages right now. Why? Norway pumps massive amounts of oil out of the sea and has hydroelectricity. Why would you be suffering a shortage?
Well, we basically don't use either oil or gas for our own energy consumption here in Norway. We utilize, as you mentioned, hydropower. And this has been the driest hydrological season in 21 years. So we have low reservoir levels and therefore a lack of energy also in our system here in Norway.
Yeah, I understand that something like 85% of energy use in Norway comes from hydro, and that because of what you've just explained, you are going to suffer a shortage. Now, we do rely on you for some of our energy. Can I just ask you a direct question? Are we going to be able to rely on you this winter to help keep our lights on?
Absolutely. I think we need to be able to use our electricity in a smart manner. We have already seen consumption levels go down the last year. We do everything we can to keep the lights on, both here in Norway and in our neighboring countries as well. Obviously, our hydropower role plays a crucial role as a balancing power for the electricity system, for example, also in countries like the UK. And we are going to maintain that role throughout the winter.
Of course, your experience does raise a question which we've touched on already in this programme. Everybody wants to get to net zero. The target here is 2050. In order to do that, we are going to rely on changing the energy mix to introduce more renewables. Now, you're virtually all renewables, and you are still facing a shortage. Is our policy one that's going to stand the test of time?
I think we see that by connecting our energy systems, being able to secure flows between countries, the fact that we can consume more electricity imported from the UK when it's a windy evening in the UK, and then save some of that hydropower for hours where it's crucially needed in both our countries. that is the way to go forward to be able to balance out the system. But we need to ensure that we have enough power that can be regulated to the times when it's needed the most. And that is a challenge going forward that we have to face and that we have to tackle if we are to go fully renewable in Europe going forward.
I get the point about baseload, essentially having a reliable, essential bottom level that can't be interrupted. But of course, if I may just ask one last question, almost everything can be disrupted when you have a Ukraine situation. And I suppose the question to what you've just said is that the more we rely on the interconnectedness of energy supply, the more vulnerable we are to a Putin.
I think what is happening in Europe now is a very, very grave situation. The reduced levels of gas from Russia and the way that Russia utilized gas as a strategic weapon has created an unprecedented energy crisis in Europe. But it is also an immense opportunity to build a better and stronger system to transition towards the green future that we have been talking about for so long. And doing that together, ensuring that our systems work together, actually makes us more or better positioned to tackle crisis going forward, as long as we can trust each other as neighbours and friends.
Andreas Eriksen, Deputy Energy Minister, Norway, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
OK, let's pick that up, Catherine. As long as we can trust each other, as long as we can cooperate, realistic?
Well, it's a very interesting question because Norway's energy minister stood up in the Norwegian parliament 2 weeks ago and he commented on the fact that countries like Germany and Belgium are closing nuclear reactors early for political reasons rather than because they've reached the end of their lives. And at the same time, they're putting pressure on Norway to maintain its electricity exports despite the problems that we were just hearing about within the Norwegian market. The Norwegian government is going to be subsidising its consumers to up to 90% of their energy bills this winter. 9-0. And this is very politically sensitive in Norway. And it's not unreasonable for people in Norway to say, well, hang on a minute, we've invested in all this hydro capacity, which we've paid for in our taxes over previous decades. Now we've seen our prices go up 10 times in the last year. Our taxes are now being used for these huge subsidies, and we're exporting that benefit to other countries that are failing to invest in their own generation capacity in an adequate way. And even worse, they're closing perfectly functional capacity because of some ideologies. And cross-border flows happen based on really short-term price differentials. They ignore these wider policy decisions that are still made at the national level. And I really wonder whether that's going to be sustainable in the long term.
Tom Greatrex, what do you think?
You can't completely offshore energy security. And if you try to, you end up in the type of situation we're on the edge of here. The reality is you need to have a proportion of your power to be completely your own responsibility. You need secure, reliable supply. Look, interconnectors can help, but as Catherine's just said, the price signals determine where the power goes, up until the point where that becomes politically unsustainable in whichever country, whichever state. And then I think you'll find then the pure economics and the economic model that people talk about in terms of interconnectors becomes broken very, very quickly. And that's why we have to make sure that we have, in the future, our secure, reliable, low-carbon supply is made up of the right components to ensure we can get through when it isn't windy enough. We can get through when there are situations with gas supply. We can get through when there are problems affecting the amount of water in the hydro infrastructure in Norway, for example.
Well, actually, that takes us on to what I think is a very important point, because getting through doesn't just mean producing, it means storing. And actually, that has emerged as something of an issue with our viewers' panel. I want to talk to Dave McCormack, who has some experience in this area and has raised this point about storage. Dave.
Yeah, good evening, Trevor. I worked for years as a quarry manager, supplying sands and gravels to go around underground tanks for gas storage. And I can't understand why recent governments have been so short-sighted in their energy strategies. So my question to the panel, or to anybody, is why did we do away with the storage facilities for gas and oil reserves, both overground and underground, all around the UK?
Thank you very much, Dave. Well, there is a question which is going to come to the panel. Why did we do away with our storage facilities, underground and overground? Well, Charles Hendry, this was in your hands when you were a minister.
Indeed, and it's an issue which I've campaigned about consistently. So I tried to amend Labour's Energy Act in 2010 to require more gas storage. I tried to amend the Coalition's Infrastructure Act in 2015, with Tom supporting me, to require more gas storage. And we've had a number of very close runs in the winter on our gas supplies. We had the Langeled pipeline from Norway freezing up one year. We had a winter which ran on well into April, almost into May. We've seen the threat by the Iranians to blockade the Straits of Hormuz, which would stop all Qatari gas coming through. We've seen previous disputes between Russia and Ukraine. And my view is you cannot rely on luck. And that in a number of years we have been so close, one year within hours of running out of gas, and that therefore we should have been taking long-term strategic decisions to require more gas storage to be built. There's the point which was made there, which was our main gas storage facility was closed down by Centrica in 2017, I think, and that was a commercial decision, but the government could have stopped it. Greg Clark, the Secretary of State, could have said, no, we will step in. My view is you actually...
To be fair, it wasn't a whimsical decision, was it? Centrica basically said, look, it's going to cost a fortune to keep this storage, which is a vast tank under the North Sea, to keep this in shape so it doesn't blow up. And that we're moving away from fossil fuels. Why would we want to keep this vast storage facility when actually we don't want to store this stuff anyway?
Well, because we all know we need gas as a transition fuel. Even though we're investing in renewables, we're still going to need gas. And therefore, if we're going to do that in a secure way, we've got to have more gas storage.
We're going to move on. This is the great debate. After the break, what does the future look like for our energy supply? Did we make a bet on going green that might not pay off?
It is important that we use all available sources of fuel within this country.
We have 50 years' worth of UK gas supply sitting under the north of England.
We must phase out fossil fuels, full stop.
Welcome back to The Great Debate, where we're discussing the energy crisis and asking, can we keep the lights on this winter? Well, we know there's a lot of potential in renewable energy, but the wind doesn't always blow and the sun won't shine every day. It's clear that a move to renewables will increase our energy security, but can that transition be done without relying on oil and gas? Let's talk to Stephen Fairley in Bathgate in Scotland. Good evening, Stephen. What's your view on this?
Well, the question I was wanting to put to the panel was, is it the right time to increase the use of fossil fuels and fracking when we should be looking to a greener future?
All right, Stephen's question for the panel is it the right time to increase the use of fossil fuels? Tom Greatrix.
No. I think what we should be doing is everything we can to reduce the amount of fossil fuels. Half of our electricity currently comes from fossil fuels. We can see the impact that has in terms of prices at the moment. If we'd built more low-carbon capacity earlier, we wouldn't be facing quite as extreme a situation as we are now. So, if a nuclear power station like Hinkley had been built earlier, if it was operating now, that would save the equivalent of more than £3 billion to the consumer just in 1 year. So it shows you the fact that energy instability and dirty energy and insecure energy are all solved by doing the same thing, which is reducing the amount of fossil fuels we're using to burn for electricity and increasing the amount of different low-carbon sources to get the mix that gives us a secure and reliable supply.
Catherine, I think you spoke about transition earlier on. How would you respond to Stephen's question?
I actually, unfortunately, disagree with Tom. I think that we've reached a position in our energy transition where our energy security is at risk. And I think what people forget is that energy insecurity costs lives. And when energy is too expensive, that also costs lives. So it's not just climate change that costs lives. And the reason that we talked about the energy trilemma was we were recognising those things. And in recent years, we've forgotten. We forgot that we need to maintain energy security. So if you have blackouts in the winter, traffic lights and street lights go off, people's lives are at risk immediately. People who have medical equipment in their homes that need electricity, their lives are put at risk. When people can't afford to heat their homes, their lives are put at risk. So we have to have a balance of all these things. And we do not have the capability right now to manage the intermittency of wind. And the only way that we can fill that in the short term is through fossil fuels. So talking about building more wind turbines, it doesn't help you if it's not windy. Those extra wind turbines will all just sit there not doing anything.
Charles Hendry.
I think I can find a compromise between these two, which is that in the short term, we may well need to use more gas as backup as we go through the transition. Then we have to move even more quickly in a low-carbon direction. We've got small modular reactors, very exciting nuclear technologies coming through. We've got hydrogen. I think you should be using tidal. We should be doing much more on energy efficiency. There's a whole range of areas where the future, I think, looks very green and very exciting. But we've got to get through this current crisis, and then we need to have gas as part of that. I don't think fracking's the answer. The UK government has said it's where communities want it. There isn't going to be a single one which wants it. But I think that we do need to be making sure that we can then accelerate more quickly.
Liam, do you think Charles's programme is the way through?
I think from what I understand, we have enough oil and gas to get us through the next 8 years. It's a completely immoral situation for a government to be preparing licensing for over 130 new oil and gas projects, which is what it's currently doing. And that's why Insulate Britain are supporting the Just Stop Oil Coalition, who are out in London at the moment in civil resistance against the criminal government, who are out to destroy the very fabric of our society.
Criminal government?
It's treason, yeah.
Wow.
They're committing treason upon the people of this country.
I think there's some reaction to that, but let's just go, finally, if I may, to Jackie Skip on the discussion as a whole. Jackie, in rugby, what's your thought?
I just don't think we can ever abandon net zero. And I think we're regularly watching the horrors that climate change wreaks on us, really. And this just massively outweighs any problems we're facing now.
OK, Jackie, you have given us a real hard choice here, and I'm going to put this hard choice to our viewers' panel. Even if it means, for example, these rolling blackouts, even if it means that we're going to have to pay more for boilers and so on, the things we've been discussing tonight, I would like those who think that, in spite of all of that, we must still stick to the net zero by 2050 target. Those who still think that that target is both desirable and achievable, and we should stick to it. I am seeing those who want, throw your hands up. OK, and those, you can put your hands down, and those who think that actually that may not any longer be an absolute 100% priority that we need to stick to. Those who think net zero, in the face of what we're looking at, may have to be put back. OK, I think there's still a majority for sticking with net zero. Thank you. And that is all we have time for this evening. It just remains for me to say thank you to our panellists here in the studio. Tom Greatrex, Charles Hendry, Liam Norton, and Catherine Porter. Of course, as always, it's you at home who remain at the centre of our conversation, and if you'd like to be part of the programme next time, you can get in touch by emailing The Great Debate at sky.uk. And for now, I want to thank you, our viewers panel, for your thoughtful, spirited contributions. Yep. And also to thank all of you for watching. At home, keep talking, and we'll see you again at the same time next week for The Great Debate.